On the concept of Sunnah in the Muwatta of Malik ibn Anas, Mcgill University, Montreal, Canada, 1969. As a conclusion, we may say that the Prophet applied the religious and ethical principles introduced by himself to the environment around him, and this activity and behavior of the Prophet became an accepted standard of conduct for his companions and their successors. Professor Coulson maintains that the companions of the Prophet carried the example of the Prophet by developing and elaborating the principles to the degree which was required by the practical problems confronting the Muslim community. He calls the first scholar jurists the religious idealists. He states, "These earliest scholar jurists gave voice to their ideas of standards of conduct which would represent the fulfillment of the true Islamic religious ethic. The starting point was the review of local practice, legal and popular. In light of the principles of conduct enshrined in the Qur'an, institutions and activities were individually considered. These approved or rejected according as to whether they measured up to or fell short of these criteria." Coulson, describing different trends in early jurisprudence, says that the early jurist doctrines represented as having roots stretching back into the past. He very explicitly holds the activity of the early jurists was linked with the Prophet, who was the ultimate starting point of the Islamic Sunnah. He says, "His," meaning the Prophet's, authority lay in the fact that he was the closest in time and spirit to the Qur'an, and as such was the ultimate starting point of the Islamic Sunnah. Therefore, Coulson concluded the accepted standard of conduct of the Prophet was carried through after him continuously by the latter generations, and the base and ground of the jurist activities was the Prophet himself, who was the ultimate starting point of the Islamic Sunnah. Now, the religious ethical principles introduced by the Prophet, which later became the recognized Islamic religious norms in the words of Professor Schatt, and the accepted standard of conduct in the terminology of Professor Coulson, are known as the basic and fundamental principles in the terminology of Shah Waliullah, and they are called the foundational principles by Dr. Iqbal. Accepted standard of conduct, recognized religious norms, basic fundamental principles, foundational principles. 4 different scholars, 4 different terms. Dr. Iqbal, tracing the link of these foundational principles to the Prophet, concludes that they were the guide of the early jurists. Our early doctors of law, taking their cue mainly from this groundwork, evolved a number of legal systems. Fazl Rahman has summed up this view on the issue as follows. The conclusions we have arrived at so far are first that the Sunnah and the hadith were coeval and co-substantial in their earliest phase after Muhammad, and that both were directed towards and drew their normativity from this. As the legal institutions and the consciousness of moral and religious issues became more and more complex, controversies arose on most points, and in the theological and moral sphere, especially where there were foreign influences, the concept of an ideal Sunnah was retained. Whatever new material was thought out or assimilated, it was given an interpretation of the principles of the Qur'an and the Sunnah. It may be gathered from the foregoing that the standard of conduct or the Sunnah of the Prophet set forth and introduced by the Prophet was not only valid and operative during his time for the Muslim community, but it continued to remain so after him. 6. There is, however, another side of this picture too. That is, the introduction of the Sunnah of the Prophet into the jurisprudential source of Islam was not the work of the Prophet himself, but rather it was introduced by later generations. This view was held by Professor C. Snook Hurongji in his book Mohammedanism, and by Professor H. Laymans in his work Islam, Beliefs and Institutions, and by Professor D.S. Margolioth in his work The Early Development of Mohammedanism. They hold that the second source of Islamic law was the customary law of the community, approved by the persons of authority. Professor Margolioth has summed up this view in these words: "It seems clear that the second source of law was not yet anything quite definite, and merely what was customary and what had the approval of persons of authority, all of whom presently merged in the Prophet." In light of these conclusions drawn by the above authorities, and through his own penetrating and laborious research, Professor Schatt has concluded that Shafi'i was the first lawyer to define Sunnah as the model behavior of the Prophet, in contrast with his predecessors, for whom it was not necessarily connected with the Prophet, but represented the tradition, albeit ideal usage of the community. We have established ideal usage of the community. And we've established in the previous sections that 1. Sunnah originally and primarily means introducing a model of conduct and setting up an example as a distinguished form to follow. 2. The Prophet during his lifetime had successfully replaced the ancient Arabian standard of behavior by his exemplary conduct and established an accepted standard of behavior for the Muslim community in contradistinction to the pre-Islamic tribal society. 3. This exemplary behavior of the Prophet as concept, in contradistinction to the ancient Arabian standard of conduct, was valid and operative from the very beginning of Islam, and remained so after him during the time of the companions and latter generations. But the formulation and transmission of the term Sunnah of the Prophet as conscious concept was probably later. By juxtaposing the above detailed evidence and our conclusions from it on the one hand, and the view expressed by Professor Harunji, Laymans and Mcgill University on the other hand, we want to show that there is no real contradiction in them as apparently it seems to be. Because what these people say is that the second source of law was not yet anything quite definite, but merely what was customary and had the approval of persons of authority. It is, it seems, another way of saying that the second source of law, i.e. the Sunnah of the Prophet, as a term was not employed initially. Only later did it come into its true usage. The following words in the statement of Professor Mcgill University are very important in this connection. The second source of law was that which had the approval of persons of authority. Now, persons of authority after the Prophet were his senior companions and their successors and so forth. According to the statement, the second sources of law was that which had the approval of persons of authority, and we have seen previously that the standard of approval and judgment of these authorities was nothing but what they had inherited from the Prophet as his exemplary behavior, an accepted standard of conduct, not yet labelled by means of that explicit term, the Sunnah of the Prophet. Because this term appeared later in the words of Mcgill University, all of whom presently merged in the Prophet, without accepting this interpretation, it is hard to understand the following statement of Mcgill University in the same book, in which he says, according to all appearances, the death of the Prophet made at first little difference in the conduct of affairs, because his successors were the most trustworthy advisers, their persons most familiar with his ideas and plans. The Qur'an bids its devotees take as their models those who have been guided, and in practice urges that the Prophet is a pattern of conduct. Naturally, his immediate associates were supposed to have resembled him most closely, and what they did became a norm of conduct far below, indeed, that which was attributed to the Prophet, but at least analogous to it. Whoso follows their example could not go wrongly. We cannot doubt that the mode of life pursued by the Prophet exercised a great influence on his environment, and the process spread through the ever-expanding area of Islam. This should be the interpretation of Professor Sa'd's statement regarding the statement that Shafi was the first lawgiver to define Sunnah as the model of the behavior of the Prophet. In other words, the Sunnah of the Prophet as a non-verbal standard of conduct introduced by the Prophet was present from the beginning as an explicit legal term. From the beginning, but as an explicit legal term was defined by Ash-Shafi'i, though he maintains that the term was introduced into the theory of Islamic law, presumably towards the end of the 1st century by scholars of Iraq. Stay tuned for many more parts.